The moment this story exploded, it wasn't just another whisper from palace corridors, it was a thunderclap that shook the carefully polished walls of the monarchy. Because suddenly, a question that had floated quietly for years was forced into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. What exactly did Prince Edward inherit? And why does his legal team now say it proves a narrative the palace once denied? What followed was not just a royal clarification. It was a controlled legal detonation that pulled Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the entire inheritance debate back into the spotlight with dangerous intensity. It all erupted on February 3, 2026, when the usually quiet and cautious Prince Edward stepped forward with something the royal family rarely unleashes in public. A carefully worded legal rebuttal, not an emotional denial, not a vague palace statement. A legal explanation packed with trustees, contracts, and institutional rules. And the target of that explanation was the newest wave of allegations circulating after claims raised by Meghan Markle during a recent podcast discussion. But here's where things became explosive. Because Edward didn't simply deny the claims, he dismantled them piece by piece. For months, whispers had been spreading that royal inheritances were secretly manipulated, that certain family members had quietly redirected wealth, leaving others locked out of assets they were promised. The narrative was simple and emotionally powerful. Someone had been cheated out of what was rightfully theirs. That storyline had been echoing through headlines since the fallout from Oprah Winfrey's explosive 2021 interview, where royal finances and family tensions were dragged into global debate. But Edward's lawyers walked into the conversation with something that gossip rarely survives: paperwork. According to the legal clarification, the entire controversy surrounding royal inheritance was being framed incorrectly from the beginning. The property at the center of speculation, the sprawling royal estate known as Bagshot Park, was never a simple inheritance jackpot waiting to be cashed in. Instead, it exists under an intricate 150-year lease agreement negotiated years earlier and structured with strict legal limitations. And that changes everything, because on paper, Bagshot Park might look like a fortune. A massive mansion with roughly 120 rooms, sitting on more than 50 acres of land, valued by commentators somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million depending on how the market is calculated. The headlines practically write themselves: a royal property worth tens of millions. But the legal documents reveal something very different. This isn't a freehold palace Edward can simply sell tomorrow to clear debts or cash out for personal wealth. The lease comes with heavy restrictions, covenants, stewardship obligations, permissions required for major changes. In other words, it's not a golden ticket, it's a responsibility. A custodial arrangement designed to protect royal heritage rather than convert it into personal cash. And that single clarification collapsed one of the most dramatic claims circulating in royal gossip circles: the idea that royal heirs could simply liquidate inherited property whenever they needed money. Edward's team made something very clear. These assets were never designed to behave like normal personal property. They were structured as part of an institutional system meant to survive generations. And the legal structure goes even deeper. Because Edward's inheritance is not just tied to property, it is tied to a global charitable institution created by his father, Prince Philip, and supported by the late monarch Queen Elizabeth II. That institution, the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, operates across roughly 140 countries, involving hundreds of thousands of young participants every single year. This isn't a business. It isn't a financial portfolio. It's a massive charitable ecosystem governed by trustees and strict legal obligations. So when Edward describes himself inheriting stewardship rather than wealth, the distinction matters. Because trusteeship means responsibility, not ownership. And suddenly the entire financial debate around royal inheritance looks very different. The timeline itself reveals how complicated these arrangements became. The chain of events began with Prince Philip's death in April 2021, which triggered a cascade of succession discussions behind closed palace doors. Then came the far larger shock to the system: the death of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8, 2022, which activated a massive administrative process governing royal estates, trusts, and titles. Inside that complex process, many decisions were finalized quietly. Royal wills, by long-standing legal precedent, can remain sealed for decades, sometimes up to 90 years, meaning the public rarely sees the details immediately. Instead, the arrangements unfold gradually through legal filings, title confirmations, and administrative settlements. One of the most significant moments arrived on March 10, 2023, when Edward officially received the title Duke of Edinburgh. That title was not simply symbolic. It carried institutional responsibilities connected to Philip's legacy programs and charitable networks. But while these arrangements were unfolding quietly through legal channels, the public conversation outside the palace was moving in an entirely different direction. Podcasts, commentators, tabloid speculation. The rumor machine painted a dramatic picture of hidden royal wealth being withheld or redirected. Edward's statement appears designed to shut that narrative down completely, because the real structure behind royal inheritance, according to his lawyers, is far less sensational, but far more complicated. These assets are layered through trusts, corporate vehicles, and legal guardianship structures specifically designed to prevent short-term liquidation, meaning even if someone wanted to sell them, they often legally cannot. This is the monarchy's defensive architecture, and Edward made it clear that architecture exists for one reason: to protect dynastic heritage from being broken apart or converted into quick personal liquidity. Behind the scenes, allies inside the royal system reportedly helped reinforce this strategy. Prince William is said to have played a stabilizing role in maintaining governance structures around royal estates, while Edward's wife Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, pushed strongly for a preservation-first approach that prioritizes long-term custodianship over financial speculation. Together, that coalition represents a different vision of royal inheritance, not as a treasure chest to be divided, but as a legacy to be managed. Which brings us back to the core shock of this entire controversy. Because Edward's lawyers didn't just clarify what he inherited, they revealed something that changes the entire conversation about royal wealth. Much of what people believe the royals own is actually locked inside structures that behave less like personal property and more like public trust. Meaning the real royal inheritance isn't money. It's control, stewardship, and responsibility over assets that cannot easily be sold. And that revelation quietly dismantles one of the most persistent myths surrounding the monarchy: the idea that royal heirs sit on unlimited piles of liquid wealth ready to spend or sell whenever they choose. Instead, what Edward's legal clarification shows is something far more complicated, a system deliberately designed to prevent exactly that. And once that reality collided with the ongoing media narrative surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the financial and political implications inside royal circles became impossible to ignore. Because if these assets cannot be easily monetized, then the entire public argument about denied inheritance suddenly looks very different. And what comes next may reveal why Edward's calm, lawyer-driven rebuttal wasn't just a defense. It may have been the opening move in a much larger battle over reputation, credibility, and the future structure of royal power. The real storm didn't start when the lawyers spoke. It started when people realized what their words actually meant. Because once Prince Edward's legal clarification entered the public arena, the entire narrative that had been circulating for years suddenly began to collapse under the weight of legal reality. And for those who had built their arguments around the idea that royal inheritance could be flipped into instant cash, that realization landed like a cold shock. For a long time, the public conversation surrounding the Sussex saga had leaned heavily on a dramatic assumption. If royal assets existed, estates, trusts, heirlooms, then surely they could be sold, monetized, converted into the kind of liquidity that could resolve private financial pressures or debts. It was a simple storyline, easy to understand and even easier for commentators to amplify. But the legal architecture surrounding the monarchy is anything but simple, and Edward's statement pulled the curtain back on a system designed precisely to prevent that kind of scenario. At the center of the entire dispute sits the structure governing Bagshot Park, the historic royal residence that has been repeatedly cited as one of the most valuable assets linked to Edward's inheritance. On paper, the numbers look dramatic. The estate itself is enormous, a sprawling residence of more than 100 rooms surrounded by acres of protected land. Market observers have frequently thrown around valuations approaching 30 million, sometimes even higher, depending on how the estate's prestige is factored into the calculation. But those valuations are headline mathematics, not legal reality. What Edward's lawyers emphasized is that the property is not owned outright. Instead, it exists under a long-term leasehold arrangement extending roughly 150 years, originally negotiated with a substantial upfront premium, reportedly around $5 million. That kind of leasehold can create a powerful economic position, but it comes with boundaries. Leasehold interests are governed by covenants, obligations, and oversight mechanisms that restrict how the property can be transferred, altered, or commercialized. In short, the estate may appear enormously valuable on paper, but its legal structure prevents it from being treated like a personal asset that can simply be sold off when convenient. And that distinction is precisely why Edward's rebuttal hit such a nerve, because it transformed what had been framed as a financial controversy into something far more technical, a legal debate about stewardship versus ownership. Behind the scenes, lawyers and financial observers immediately understood the implications. If an inheritance consists primarily of trust interests, leasehold arrangements, and institutional patronages, then creditors or critics cannot treat those interests as disposable capital. They must first navigate the legal forms governing those assets. Is the beneficiary a direct owner, a trustee, a leaseholder under restrictive covenants? Each classification changes what can and cannot legally happen next. Edward's statement leaned heavily into that legal distinction. He described the inheritance not as a pool of wealth, but as a network of responsibilities embedded inside institutional frameworks. The charitable programs associated with Prince Philip's legacy, especially the Duke of Edinburgh's award, operate as independent entities governed by trustees and and fiduciary obligations. Those programs exist for youth development and educational initiatives across the world. Their assets are not personal property to be liquidated. They are bound by the same legal expectations that govern any large charity. That legal framing effectively dismantled one of the most sensational claims circulating in public discourse: the suggestion that members of the royal family could secretly unlock vast reserves of money simply by selling inherited estates or programs. But Edward's lawyers were not speaking only to the public. Their words carried another message, one aimed squarely at the world of lenders and creditors. But this story is still unfolding. Lawyers, trustees, financial institutions, and government officials will continue navigating the complicated territory where royal tradition meets modern legal scrutiny. Documents may surface. Court inquiries may arise. Market reactions will evolve. What Edward's rebuttal has done, however, is redraw the battlefield. No longer is the conversation simply about family drama or emotional grievances. It is about legal structures, fiduciary duties, and the protection of assets that represent centuries of national heritage. And in that arena, the cold, meticulous world of law, gossip rarely survives.